Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold, talking about the dynamic between rents and prices, how to keep your vacancy rate low, and the relationship between landlords and tenants. Learn about how a newer vehicle can give you a big lump of cash from your property without you having to make any payments. Then, inflation is your wealth building friend. Yeah, really. Today on Get Rich Education. Mid-South homebuyers, they're total pros. With over 2 decades as the nation's highest-rated turnkey provider, their empathetic property managers use your ROI as their North Star. So it's no wonder that smart investors just keep lining up to get their completely renovated income properties like it's the newest iPhone. They're headquartered in Memphis and have globally attractive cash flows, an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, and now over 5,000 houses renovated. There's zero markup on maintenance, let that sink in, and they average a 98.9% occupancy rate, while their average renter stays more than 3.5 years. Every home they offer has brand new components, a bumper-to-bumper 1-year warranty, new 30-year roofs, and, wait for it, a high-quality renter. Remember that part? And in an astounding price range, $100 to $180K. I've personally toured their office and their properties in person in Memphis. Get to know Mid-South. Enjoy cash flow from day one. Start yourself right now at midsouthhomebuyers.com. That's midsouthhomebuyers.com. When you want the best real estate and finance info, the modern internet experience limits your free articles access, and it's replete with paywalls, and you get pop-ups and push notifications and cookies disclaimers. Ugh. At no other time in history has it been more vital to place nice, clean, free content in your hands that actually adds no hype value to your life. That's why this is the golden age of quality newsletters, and I write ours myself. It's got a dash of humor, and it is to the point. To get it, it couldn't be more simple. Just type up a text message with the letters GRE in the body and send it to the phone number 66866. And when you start the free newsletter, you'll also get my 1-hour fast real estate course completely free. Subscribe to my Don't Quit Your Daydream newsletter, and your mind will be wired for wealth. Text GRE to 66866. Text GRE to 66866.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Villanova, Pennsylvania to Villanueva, Colombia, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold, and you're listening to Get Rich Education. I'm really grateful to have you, as always. When you invest, you are buying a day that you don't have to work. That's what we're helping you do here every single week. Own real estate, and it's going to allow you to buy back big chunks of time for yourself later. And that's a big deal because your very life is made up of chapters of time. It's actually really cool when you own investment properties in a few different places, then you actually own part of, say, Indiana and Tennessee and Georgia. You own parts of those states. That's what we help you do here. And that sounds cool. Sounding cool, though, is not enough. There need to be good fundamental reasons behind the real estate portfolio that you are building. It's kind of interesting. With rental property investing, you're kind of doing the little things in order to hold together the big, profitable picture, because there are all these forces that are simultaneously creating wealth for you when you've got income property with a loan. So yeah, you're just sort of trying to hold it together. You say don't get your vacant property rented as soon as you want, so you might drop the rent $50 and add a nice new kitchen faucet, and ta-da, just like that, it's rented. And all while you're doing those little things to hold it together, whether your property is vacant or rented, you are benefiting from leverage and inflation profiting on your loan. You're benefiting from some big forces either way. Well, on today's show, first we're going to be talking about the little things like the one-on-one relationship between you and your tenant. And then later on the show today, that's when we'll grow and talk about a more macro force, like new ways for you to think about how you're benefiting from inflation. When we talk about rents, prices, and the relationship between a real estate investor like you and your tenant, recently on the show here, I talked about how the 4.6% growth in wages like we do have today, that is a harbinger of you getting future rent growth. And this can get rent growth to catch up with the growth that we've had in property prices. And note that this is what happens. You need to remember that the bid format of buying property, that allows for more rapid price escalation than the first come, first serve at a set price format that you have when you're trying to rent out your property. All right, when you put up a property for sale, or you're the person that's buying one, well, that's usually not in a first come, first serve process. That's more of a competitive bid process. And see, that is exactly why in a hot market, real estate prices can run up fast. But because, say, you're renting out a property and you're doing that, you're usually not accepting offers from prospective tenants and then taking the tenant that has the highest bid. Well, instead, with rents, you're just taking the qualified first tenant that agrees to your fixed rent price of, say, $2,000. Okay, your prospective tenant isn't saying, oh, I really like your rental single-family home, so I'll pay you $2,200 for it instead of the $2,000 that you're asking. And see, that right there is why, in a hot market, property prices run up faster than rents do. But see, when prices run up faster than rents, like they did starting about 4 years ago, what happens is that begins to make rents, oh, well, they look like a relative bargain to people that are seeking housing. So that is the time, that pivot point, when rents catch up with prices, which is the cycle that I hope we are getting into next. Now, right now, we happen to be at a time of year where tenants tend to stay put. There isn't as much turnover as you approach the holidays, but a few months from now, turnover tends to pick up in the springtime. And before we talk about the economics of what you do when you have a vacant unit, understand that despite the national housing shortage, the rental vacancy rate really is not that low nationwide. Do you have any idea what the historically average rental vacancy rate is? You have any guess there? It's about 7%, 7.3% to be exact. That's why when you run your cash flow analysis for a property, using 1 month per year is usually pretty safe. That's about 8%. Well, all right, we've established that the long-term national rate of vacancy is 7.3%. The current vacancy rate is 6.9%. And yes, that number is just what it sounds like. It's simply the percentage of rental inventory that's available for rent, and it maxed out at 11% back in 2009. That's when housing was badly overbuilt. And now with the housing shortage, you'll see that today's vacancy rate is only a little below normal, 7.3 versus 6.9. Maybe you're wondering, well, why isn't it even lower, like 5 or 6%? Well, one big reason why vacancy rates are just a little lower than the long-run average is all of the apartment overbuilding, like I discussed with you 2 weeks on the show, and I told you about my walk on Rainy Street in Austin, Texas last month, where they're building gobs of 500-foot-tall apartment towers that aren't going to be occupied for a while, and I called that area America's Apartment Oversupply Ground Zero. But as you know, there are so many ways to parse and dissect real estate markets. The vacancy rate for apartment buildings today is 7.8% nationally, but for single-family rental homes, it's only 5.4%. That's because their supply is more scarce. But since there aren't many new apartment projects just getting started now, they're just completing when they started about 2 years ago, I would expect the apartment vacancy rate to come down over the next couple of years. And then, of course, each local area is going to have its own vacancy rate too. I mean, there are so many ways to parse, to bifurcate real estate, and all those figures I gave you are per the US Census. Well, I've explained to you before that when you have a vacant unit, that is the time for you to really push it. Test the market. Start your asking rent up rather high in order to see what you can get for it. And this is what's known in economics in the free market as price discovery. This is your time for price discovery, but you usually only want to keep the rent way high for just a few days. Otherwise, you might needlessly increase your vacancy period. But here's the thing. If your unit is vacant after a number of showings, is it better for you to drop the rent? Or instead, is it better for you to make some upgrades to the unit and keep that higher asking rent? Well, like seemingly everything in real estate investing, the short answer for you is it depends. All right, the upside of you dropping the rent is that it's a lot quicker and easier to do than making an upgrade to the unit. I mean, just snap your fingers and it's done. Dropping the rent might only take a few seconds or minutes. But see, when you keep the higher asking rent and you make upgrades, you do more than just increase your rent income. You get a better quality tenant, first of all. And secondly, if you get, say, 5% more rent, depending on your leverage position, you might get 10% more cash flow, that money that you feel in your pocket every month. A lot of landlords don't even consider those two attributes right there. See, when you get 5% more rent for a unit, your tenant, of course, they only have to pay 5% more, yet you yourself, as the property provider, you're getting perhaps 8% or 10% or 12% more money in your pocket because of the leverage. And right there, I essentially just described the third crown of Get Rich Education's inflation triple crown for you. That third crown is called cash flow enhancement. And really, there's another, I guess, a third here, wealth building attribute that you've accomplished through achieving a higher rent. And that is, if it happens to be a 5+ unit apartment building, you also actually just increase the value of the entire property since they are valued on the net operating income and the cap rate. So we're talking about vacancy, rent, and real estate economics here with three distinct elements that I just described about how upgrading and achieving a higher rent gives you a lot of distinct advantages, the downside of it being that it takes more time. And there's another one. What are we up to here? A fourth upside to upgrading and achieving more asking rent as opposed to doing the minimum for lower rent. And that is, well, it's your pride of ownership. I mean, you're providing good housing. Now, your whole mission is not about altruism alone, but you'll feel like you're on a more fulfilling mission when you are, like I often say, providing housing that's clean, safe, still affordable, and functional. There's a fifth reason, and that is that higher rents help you deal with higher operating expenses, but maybe it's beyond just the way in which you're thinking. And a lot of people really don't understand this or put this together. In fact, I was talking with a real estate investor last month at the New Orleans Investment Conference. He was talking about rising insurance expenses on his properties, saying that he had one property that just had a insurance premium increase of 10%. And he sounded a little disappointed, saying that, well, I can't get 10% more rent, but I've got this 10% higher insurance premium. So, he was thinking that he was losing. No, he's not necessarily losing, because in absolute dollar terms, you're charging your tenant multiples more in rent than what you're being charged in insurance. Say that you're charging $2,000 in rent on a unit. All right, well, on a monthly basis, just say that your insurance payment works out to $200 on that unit. All right, well, with just 5% more rent, that's $2,100, a $100 increase. But if your insurance goes up 10% from $200 to $220, that's just a $20 increase. So right there, in that example, your rent increase is half of your insurance rate increase percentage-wise, but in dollar terms, your rent just went up 5 times as fast as your insurance did, and you are even more cash flow positive than you were previously. So the point is, in your monthly profit and loss statement, your cash flow statement on your property, even your pro forma, keep in mind that your rent amount, that is the biggest monthly number, and being attentive to it can cure so many ills. And when you realize this plethora of positives, if you will, it can make a decision to, yeah, do something like replace that old Berber carpet with new vinyl plank flooring and make that look more attractive to you. And it's going to look more attractive to your tenant. And you're probably going to get a higher quality tenant than what you would have placed otherwise. And when you upgrade a unit, not only is your property worth more, but you usually don't pay a higher insurance premium as a result of making that upgrade at all, despite your higher valuation. In fact, sometimes lower rents are subsidized by deferred maintenance, like a leaky faucet or a big crack in a ceiling. All right, now all of these things are sort of hard economic facts. When it comes to the relationship between landlord and tenant, let me then tell you about a, I guess, softer sensibility. Okay, let's get touchy-feely for a minute, and that is the words that we use. In fact, those very landlord and tenant words themselves. Back in 2021, there was a first of its kind legislation that was proposed in Ohio to change references in their state law from the word landlord to housing provider and from the word tenant to resident. Now, I think that the word landlord is a rather strange word. I mean, it's kind of weird that we're still using that term today. In fact, in the small town that I grew up in Appalachia, it was not an affluent area at all, not even close. It was lower middle class. But even as a kid, I knew that my parents owned their home and that all of my friends' parents owned their homes too. It wasn't until I was about age 13 when the Petrosky family moved into town, Coudersport, Pennsylvania, and they were nice kids. I befriended them, and they soon started using the term landlord. I might have been about 13 until I had even heard the word landlord, and I still remember then that it struck me as a strange sounding term. Now, it was all simple, small, single-family homes where I grew up, like these 80-year-old Victorian homes. No one tried to divide their yard with fences. People didn't lock their doors. It was great. And anyway, the Petroskys lived in a single-family home that the landlord, Mr. Hosley, had divided up into 3 separate walled-off units. That's before the term house hacking even existed. But in fact, landlord, it is a feudal and perhaps outdated term, and I'd have to agree that instead of landlord, the term housing provider, it better describes you and I's role and the relationship to our tenants or residents. I mean, the word landlord, that almost sounds like a person is totalitarian or dictatorial, when in fact most landlords are people like you, smaller and family owned, not land barons. I mean, HUD will tell you that America has 10 to 11 million individual investor landlords, and they manage an average of just 2 units each. Okay, so hardly dictatorial, not some tyrant that's going around trying to evict everyone, not despotic. Let me practice a little with you today as I'll try to use the term housing provider instead of landlord as much as I can here. See, sometimes what happens in society is that the frustration of poverty gets loaded onto housing providers, and that sets up a system of enforcement that assumes that they have an interest in crushing the people that pay them to keep their property businesses running. And the reason that, say, a food provider, like a grocer, or an entertainment provider, like a basketball team owner, they just don't seem to be as unpopular as a housing provider. And one reason for that is because housing is expensive and it's also non-discretionary, meaning that everyone has to have housing. So you might consider using the term housing provider more often than landlord, especially around your tenants. If your tenant thinks of you as a housing provider that has to pay a mortgage and operating expenses every month, rather than a landlord that turns every dollar of rent income into pure profit, which is never true, well, if they understand that, you're going to be doing better from a tenant relations standpoint. And that's also completely truthful as well. As far as that Ohio state law and changing the word tenant to resident, yeah, over the years, I know that a lot of people favor that term, including a lot of our turnkey providers at GRE Marketplace. I've rode around in cars with them and they're talking about their market, and they prefer the term resident to tenant. Now, tenant is a feudal term as well. It refers to someone who occupies land from a lord. The more direct term from feudal times is the word vassal. You might remember that from high school, VASSAL. That means a holder of a land that pays allegiance to a lord. Somehow, to me, the word tenant, it just doesn't feel as feudal or like it's almost part of a system of oppression like the word landlord feels. Landlord feels like some king brooding over his serfs. In fact, the word tenant is actually helpful because if you tell me that a person is a resident, I don't know whether they own or they rent, but if you tell me they're a tenant, I know that they're renting. So tenant helps because it's more descriptive, and tenant does not sound to me like someone is being oppressed either. But in any case, consider using housing provider rather than landlord here in the soft skills department. It can be hard to remember to do that, though. You're listening to Get Rich Education Podcast, episode 532. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Education is in our name, and I've got more learning for you. Let's discuss something new and learn about what HEIs are. That stands for Home Equity Investment, and see if one of them can help you. Now, HEIs, they're a pretty new way where you can access a chunk of your home's equity without you having to make any ongoing payments. I mean, does that sound amazing or what? Okay, it does sound amazing. You get a chunk of money out of your property now without making any payments, but there are some downsides to HEIs, as you might have guessed. All right, well, first let's talk about the way that it works. Okay, with an HEI, what happens is that a portion of your home's equity is given to you in cash. It's basically given to you by an investment group. Hey, windfall moment sounds amazing. And it gets even better because you can use the funds however you like. I mean, what could you do with an extra few tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash? Further, unlike some of the better known vehicles like home equity lines of credit and home equity loans, there are truly no payments for you to make with these HEIs. Again, home equity investment. That's what we're talking about here. And better yet, you can access your funds in as little as a few weeks. And yes, I mean, this sounds amazing, but you have got to be wondering, what is the catch with HEIs? And there are some. What is in it for the investor is this investment group. Well, when you're ready to settle the investment years down the road, they are going to be paid out their agreed upon share as the percentage of the sale price or the appraised value. All right, so as you balance that and think that through, who is an HEI for then? It's good for a borrower like you in case you don't have great credit, or if you have a high debt to income ratio. It's especially great if you are house rich and cash poor. And the reason that I'm talking about HEIs now is that more people find themselves in that very situation today, house rich and cash poor. And that's because Americans are sitting on all-time record equity levels of more or less 300K today, all right? That is the house rich part, and more Americans are cash poor today. That's due to higher inflation. All right, well, now that you know the basics of what a home equity investment is and what the upsides are, what about the downsides? More downsides of feeling this near-term windfall without you having to make any payments. Well, your mortgage company might block you from taking on an HEI because, see, what you're doing is you're taking on another lien holder. Understand that with an HEI, you've now got more of a lien than you do a loan. And much like a reverse mortgage, HEIs can also have high fees. And additionally, down the road, that investor might take a big chunk of the home's appreciation. That stuff should all be laid out in your terms up front. So that's something you ought to be able to see coming. All right, well, now we're a real estate investing show here. So you're probably wondering, okay, great. And you've been hearing me use the word home. But can you get it on your non-owner occupied property? Yes, at times you can get an HEI on rental property, but the terms are probably going to be less advantageous than they will be on your primary residence. Now, you might see HEIs referred to as a product of financial innovation, which is sort of synonymous with another term, financial engineering. And whenever you see those terms, you typically want to exercise caution. Now, that alone doesn't mean that an HEI is wrong for you. And of course, with any investment type, although it's usually not your main decision driver, you're going to want to learn about the tax consequences as well. And you might note that home equity investments are also known as a home equity sharing agreement. And although that's a longer term, it is more descriptive and it makes sense because you and an investor partner are essentially sharing in your home's equity together. Now, as a GRE follower, you're able to understand what an investment like this would mean to you and your financial future, since the rate of return from home equity is always, yes, always, zero with an HEI. Now you can separate out some equity, and now you'll have the potential for dollars that can earn a return somewhere, and you're going to enjoy better liquidity as well. But caveat emptor, buyer beware with HEIs. The GRE studio has been mobilized a lot lately as I am here in Anchorage, Alaska today. And what am I doing here? Well, besides studying the housing market, not any local one, but the national housing market, I have also been skiing this week. Hey, when it comes to subscribing to our newsletter, which I do write myself, you might not have realized something. I don't overwhelm your inbox. When you start subscribing, you'll get a welcome set of emails that send every other day for about 10 days, but that's just in the beginning. After that, my newsletter is only sent about weekly whenever there's something critical in the real estate investing world that you really need to know about. It's also brief. It's important to keep it short because your time is valuable. And have you ever noticed that even the word abbreviation is too long? Our Don't Quit Your Daydream newsletter is always less than a 5-minute read. It's usually less than a 3-minute read. To get the letter, just text GRE to 66866 right now. See, even opting in to get my crucial letter is brief. Now you can text GRE to 66866. More next. I'm Keith Weinhold. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Oh, geez. The national average bank account pays less than 1% on your savings, so your bank is getting rich off of you. You've got to earn way more, or else you're losing your hard-earned cash to inflation. Let the liquidity fund help you put your money to work with minimum risk. Your cash generates up to a 10% return and compounds year in and year out instead of earning less than 1% in your bank account. The minimum investment is just $25K. You keep getting paid until you decide you want your money back. Their decade-plus track record proves they've always paid their investors 100% in full and on time. And you know how I know? Because I'm an investor in this myself. Earn 10% like me and GRE listeners are. Text FAMILY to 66866 to learn about Freedom Family Investments Liquidity Fund on your journey to financial freedom through passive income. Text FAMILY to 66866. Hey, you can get your mortgage loans at the same place where I get mine at Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They provided our listeners with more loans than any provider in the entire nation because they specialize in income properties. They help you build a long-term plan for growing your real estate empire with leverage. You can start your pre-qualification and chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. Start now while it's on your mind at ridgelendinggroup.com. That's ridgelendinggroup.com.
What's up, everyone? This is HGTV's Tariq El Musa. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. It's been said that in your life, what you're not changing, you're choosing. Loads of investors in the 401k or conventional investment plans, they aren't changing the fact that they're only getting their money to work for them, so they're choosing to deny ethically getting other people's money to work for them. And that's why they have no option other than to work full-time until they're old. Well, when you're that savvy borrower, now you're benefiting from both the asset leverage and the inflation profiting, as we know. And the way to keep both your leverage high and the inflation profiting on your debt high is to intermittently change the fulcrum on your lever so that you don't have too much equity accumulating in your portfolio. And you also want to be investing in an inflationary environment. Be a debt decamillionaire. Remember that term that I introduced to you here a few years ago? If you have $10 million in debt at 3% inflation, you're profiting $300K per year just from that alone. Yes, the paradoxically glamorous life of having $10 million in debt, but it's all tied to income property so that your tenants make the pay down for you and inflation pays it down even faster. That debt decamillionaire, he's obviously got to be a pretty creditworthy person in order to get $10 million in debt in the first place. Yep, building lasting wealth is not conventional at all. And for the debtor, inflation is therefore your wealth building friend. It's why when you see your favorite can of La Colombe cold brew coffee, which is a favorite of mine, gosh, it's nice and frothy. If you know, you know. In fact, I'm going to crack this La Colombe triple draft latte to enjoy after the show. There, did you hear that? No, I don't have any sponsorship with them. But when you see that cold brew price go from $4 to $5, well, that effect makes most people poorer. Some people think that effect makes everyone poorer, but it's not making you and I poorer, it's enriching us. When you see consumer price inflation like that, there's a good chance that asset price inflation is occurring as well. And that's why seeing higher prices at grocery stores is probably a subtle signal that you are better off, not worse off. You're better off because you know how to arrange your financial life for inflation rather than being impoverished by it. Congratulations. Let's drink to that with a La Colombe coffee. What you're doing is you are swimming with the river flow, and almost everyone you know is struggling because they chose to swim against the inflationary river flow. See, the way that almost everyone that you know goes about earning their income is that they only earn their income once, and they earn it at their job. In an inflationary world, you effectively have to earn your fiat dollar twice. Once when you work for it, and once again when you invest to beat inflation. Otherwise, that dollar is just going to evaporate, and that seems so unfair. I mean, why should a surgeon or an athlete, engineer, programmer, accountant, why should those people that are successful in their field and serve society, why should they have to develop expertise in a second field? Why do they have to do this just to maintain the wealth that they've already built, that they produced out on the free market? Why can't you have a store of value for the future inflation is the answer. So they need to develop expertise in a second field. And that's why listening to content just like this is therefore not optional, but it's actually mandatory. In this cycle, CPI inflation peaked at 9.1% 2.5 years ago, and despite that it's come down quite a bit, it's still a little elevated. It's still not down to the Fed's transparently stated 2% target. And by the way, there is another Fed meeting in 2 days. If the Fed cuts rates more, bond yields could go higher, which means mortgage rates tend to go higher. Inflation is powerful. A lot of people will tell you that it is the main reason why Jimmy Carter wasn't reelected president in 1980, and today they'll tell you why it's the main reason that it brought down the Biden-Harris administration. But see, here's the thing. If you're able to obtain loans in the United States and some other developed countries, understand that you're in a sweet spot. And that sweet spot is a level of inflation that's actually low to moderate by world standards and not hyperinflationary. All right, now I know what you might be thinking. You're thinking like, oh, well, hyperinflation would be tremendous for a leveraged real estate investor. Now, why, though, would I say that we don't want hyperinflation? Well, there are countries with a history of hyperinflation like Turkey, Argentina, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Iran. They have a history of massive currency devaluation. And see, what happens then is that financing becomes almost non-existent in those places when that happens. I mean, history over hunches. History shows us that in places like that, forget about getting home mortgages, investor loans, a credit card, consumer debt, small business loans, unless maybe at usurious interest rates. If the U.S. had a history of hyperinflation or even sustained bouts of really high inflation, then you know what? Cooperation between borrowers and lenders becomes nearly impossible. Even those governments of those countries, they have trouble borrowing money, except maybe at maturities of a few months. And, I always like to make a borrowing lending example with you and your friend, okay? You don't want to loan your friend $1,000 for a year in hyperinflation, because if the inflation rate were 1,000%, then after a year, the $1,000 that your friend would pay you back, well, that's only $100 worth of purchasing power now. All right. That's why if the U.S. had one bout of hyperinflation, maybe that would be good because it would seriously wipe out all of your debts one time. If there became a history of that, though, then you might not get access to loans at all. I mean, who would be crazy enough to finance your growing real estate portfolio in hyperinflation? So the fact that globally, the U.S. has low to moderate inflation levels, I mean, that can be a good thing. That inflation is most of the time a more surreptitious force. It largely went without notice until the pandemic made it flare up and made that La Colombe cold brew coffee go up and made property prices and rents go up, all while your fixed mortgage payments stayed the same, totally sheltered from the inflation. All right, well, if my solution to beat inflation by taking on debt and thinking about it that way, if that's not iconoclastic enough, I've got a different strategy for beating inflation. And I think that I did quickly mention this here about a year ago when Doug Casey was our guest on the show. But yes, I do have another strategy for beating inflation, and it is controversial. It is almost blasphemy to say this out loud on any finance-related show. This inflation beating strategy, it's guaranteed to improve your quality of life. Okay, no speculation here. A guarantee of improving your quality of life. It's so simple. Anyone can easily do it. In fact, you even have companies competing with other companies to get you to do this. And the answer is to spend your money. Yes, I said it out loud. It guarantees that you'll improve your life. It's simple to do. Various counterparties are competing all over the place with each other. They're falling all over each other every single day to try to get you to do this. Well, as long as you've invested well first and you have ample liquidity, by having a healthy relationship with spending there, if that cruise to the Spanish Riviera in Majorca is going to cost you $10,000 this year, but it'll be $11,000 next year, then spend the money today and beat inflation. Yes, I said it. Spend some of your money. If you've been listening to this show and following the guidance here, yes, you can afford to do it. I mean, what is money for anyway? And sadly, some like conventional finance professionals, they are reluctant to tell you to spend your money because they're compensated by the percent of your assets that they hold under management. Inflation makes borrowing and spending then two irresponsible sounding things. Borrowing and spending make complete sense when you do it right, like income properties tied to fixed rate loans. Hey, well, I've got some cool announcements to share with you now and in future months here on the show. I've got a big collaboration coming up with longtime friend of GRE here, Robert Helms of the Real Estate Guys, and I together. You'll learn more about that in the future. But first, coming up this Saturday, the 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern, over on YouTube, I am going to reveal GRE's National Home Price Appreciation Forecast. So yes, to the nearest percent, I'll tell you exactly how much home price appreciation that you will get an exact number, how much to expect in the U.S. next year. Or, hey, maybe I think that home prices will make a rare fall next year. Well, you're going to get that number if that's what I forecast. You can go to our Get Rich Education YouTube channel anytime here and make sure that you set a notification so that you are informed. Again, that's Saturday the 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern over on our Get Rich Education YouTube channel. I expect that that information is going to benefit you. Hey, if you appreciate the show here, do you think that you could help me out in just one small way? Call it my Christmas gift request. There's just one item on my Christmas list with you, and it should only take a couple minutes of your time. Leave a podcast rating and review for the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. The rating is the 5-star thing. The review is a few sentences about what you get out of the show here. I would really appreciate the, I suppose, gift from you, and I will read your review myself too. If you don't know how to do it right inside those listener apps, just open up a browser tab and search how to leave an Apple Podcasts review or Spotify podcast review or whatever platform you prefer to listen on. Yeah, it would feel like a little Christmas gift to me. After all these months and years of listening, go ahead and provide me with some feedback. Tell me what you think, and thanks so much. Until next week, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.